In Matthew 22, Jesus offers a parable that we've come to know as the parable of the wedding feast. In it, he describes a king holding a marriage feast for his son. The king sends out invitations to those who are on his guest list 2 different times. And both times those invitations were sent out, they were rejected. Angered by this, the king sends out his servants to a final group of people, and he sends them out to the highways and the byways and invites the good and the bad. Well, those particular people answer the king's invitation. He comes to the feast and he finds the whole hall filled. But in that hall he sees one man who did not have on a wedding garment. He says to the man, "Why have you come here with no wedding garment?" Of course, the man was speechless, and the king, acting very much in the way a king would in those days, has the man cast out of the wedding feast. Jesus uses language that's indicative of hell. Talks about having him bound hand and foot, casting him into outer darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus concludes the parable with this admonition, "For many are called, but few are chosen." The parable is interesting because it parallels what we see happening in the kingdom of heaven. The king, of course, is God the Father. The Son is Jesus. And the first group of invitations went out to the Jewish people. Remember, Paul says a number of times in the book of Romans that the gospel was given to the Jew first. When Jesus sent out his apostles and later the 70, he sent them to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And indeed, that's what we see taking place not only during the ministry of Jesus, but also in the early church. That the gospel was sent first to the nation of Israel. But by and large, that nation rejected the invitation, or as Jesus says, they were not willing to come. They were on the guest list, but they weren't interested in accepting the invitation. In fact, their rejection was so complete that some people in that second group went so far as to kill the servants that had been sent to invite them to the feast. Jesus says that the king, God the Father, was so angered by this that he eventually destroyed their city. Of course, that's an indication of Jerusalem's destruction in another 40 or so years after this parable was first given. So who's the final group? Who's the final group? Well, the final group, I believe, are the Gentiles. The invitation went out to the Jew first, and as Paul says, it also went to the Greek, to those who were non-Jews. If you're a Jew listening to this video, I want you to realize, though, that that invitation is still open to you. God is inviting you to the wedding feast for his Son. He wants you to be there. And even though the nation of Israel has largely rejected Jesus as the Messiah, the invitation is still open. The invitation is open to all. By and large, though, the invitation was accepted by the Gentiles. They came to Jesus, they accepted him as their Messiah. One thing I want to notice in this parable is how the king reacts to those who rejected his first invitation. He says to his servants in verse number 8, "The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy." Now ask yourself a question. What made that first group of people unworthy? Well, when you think about it, all of us are unworthy of the gospel invitation, are we not? Not a one of us is deserving of what God does for us. And even when you look at the parable and you look at that third set of invitations that goes out, how could you say for a moment that the people who were in the highways and the byways, the good, the bad, how could you say that they were ever worthy of that invitation? No one's worthy. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. But what made those first 2 groups unworthy was the fact that they had rejected the king's invitation. You see, our worthiness hinges upon whether or not we choose to believe, whether or not we choose to accept the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what makes us worthy. Not of who we are intrinsically, but rather because we're the ones who accept the invitation. Another thing to say about this parable has to do with that wedding garment there at the end. It's a curious part of the parable, and as you read it through the first time, perhaps after many times of reading it, you might wonder, why did the king react so severely with that man who was found unprepared? Well, in those days, a king would provide garments for his guests to wear to a special event like this. So here you can imagine the king is walking through the wedding hall, looking at all the garments that he supplied for all of his guests, and he sees one man who had not put on his garment. Now, how do you think the king would react? Well, of course he's going to be offended, right? I provided clothes for you to put on, and yet you have come here unclothed. This would have been an insult of the highest to the king. A great insult. And that's why he cast that man out. So even though that man had accepted the invitation, when the time came for the wedding feast, he was cast out. There's a lesson here for us as well. We can accept the gospel of Jesus Christ. We can accept the invitation. But if we aren't prepared for that wedding ceremony one day, God's going to cast us out. You see, it's not just enough to believe. You've got to obey. It's not enough just to believe. You've got to repent. You've got to prepare yourself for that wedding feast that's coming. Now, of course, that's salvation, right? That's, in this case, the day of judgment. Here we've got this wonderful opportunity to celebrate a momentous event with God and His Son. But if we're unprepared, God's not going to allow us to stay. So I ask you a question. Are you prepared? Maybe you believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I'm glad you do. But is there sin still in your life? Are there things that you have left undone? Are you really looking toward that day? Are you prepared for it? Or will it catch you by surprise? God has provided you with garments of righteousness. He'll clothe you with them. All you need to do is put them on. So I ask you, friend, are you ready? Are you ready for that wedding feast? I'll look forward to your questions and comments.